of the big rules in merchant processing and call this like a hidden rule. I sure didn't know about it when I was starting out. I didn't know about it until a bank called me and said, well, we're going to hold a bunch of your money and shut your account down.
Right.
And had no notice. Right. And that still happens today. I have plenty of clients that happens to.
Well, Patty, I really enjoyed our podcast interview today with Scott Adams. He is always a fantastic interviewee.
Lots of grist for the mill, a lot of stuff we need to really come to terms with.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, actually. I feel like I always enjoy the episodes where I learn something, and I definitely feel like I learned a few things today about chargebacks I didn't know, and this new idea of literally like stopping a chargeback before it even becomes a chargeback.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, I think it's a great innovation by Visa. So that was really cool. Then in questions from the field today, I talked about this race to vertical specific SaaS and this idea of kind of, we think about payment processing and the different races to card acceptance or EMV acceptance or whatever, or dual pricing or whatever. And there's this other race right now that's going on that I think our industry needs to wake up to, that's going to really change the whole marketplace. And then tell us about the Insiders Report, Patty.
Oh, I just follow on our discussion with Scott and talk about a particular case involving a chargeback company that seems to be running afoul of regulators, shall we say.
Yeah, and actually the accused is a previous interviewee. So
yes, it is.
That adds a little more context to it. Also, I'd like to mention that in this episode, we interview Scott Adams, his company, Fraud Deflect, his other company, CMP Mentors. None of these companies are paid sponsors. They're not active consulting clients of mine, and we receive no compensation, or are we promoting them for any paid reasons. We just think it's a really interesting interview, and we're excited to share it with you. So with that being said, let's dive into today's interview.
Let's do it.
Hey, everybody. Pat and I are here today with Scott Adams, who is the CEO at Fraud Deflect. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing fantastic. So we had talked before about some other things that you were doing in kind of the card not present world and all that. Give us a little bit of a context of what you've been up to since then and this new company, Fraud Deflect, that you've been working on.
Sure. Thanks. So really, since we last talked, a lot of things have happened in the industry, really. I'm not sure what you guys follow in the space, since I know you're less around the high risk type of things, but this actually affects pretty much everybody in the payment processing world. The FTC has cracked down on some companies around representment and these kind of activities, which representments are great and you're supposed to do, but you have to tell the truth and you have to provide information that actually was provided to the customer during the process. And so that's one thing that happened. And then also April, I think it was 16th, Visa launched a new program called Visa Compelling Evidence 3. And this program is really cool. And I think it's game changing for tons of merchants in that in a real-time process, you can actually collaborate with the issuer and kind of represent to that point. So like whenever a consumer calls their issuer and says, hey, I want a chargeback, or, this wasn't me, or whatever they say, then in real time, Visa will ping either a service provider or the merchant to get more information on a transaction. And if they have that information and Visa deems the dispute as something that could work for compelling evidence 3, which basically means, is it a 10.4 that's a fraud, so more or less friendly fraud transaction, and has that merchant processed transactions of the same type with the same consumer before, then they'll ping you again for a few more data points around a few more transactions, and they'll actually outright block the chargeback. And there's no fee. There is a fee, but there's no refund. So this isn't the alerts that are out there. So there's no refund. So that's huge. And that changes the game for many merchants.
Yeah.
And then finally, it's a lot of information, but finally, there's actually been some changes that are coming now and have actually started to take effect with the Visa monitoring programs. So depending on your category code, they're actually going to be lowering the thresholds. And so this kind of all comes together. And I said, we need to do something about this. And had some merchants and partners ask me if I was going to. And so we're launching Fraud Deflect to basically do the same type of thing. So, we'll have alerts just like, some others, but we're also just got accepted into the beta program for CE3. So we'll be able to provide the service for merchants and then also do representment alerts. And we're going to soon also have some friendly fraud prevention up front pre-transaction. So a lot of things have happened.
Yeah, a lot of stuff happening there, Scott. And actually, you touched on a whole lot of topics that I wanted to touch on. But let's like back up a little bit, because I'm not sure that everybody who's listening or watching today has a keen understanding of chargebacks. You know, can you maybe take a minute or two to explain chargebacks, or as Visa calls that, I think, disputes, right? How they occur, the responsibilities of various parties, and of course, you mentioned it, this so-called friendly fraud.
Sure. So yeah, that's also a lot of information. Yeah, let's start just with what a chargeback is. So, you know, I think many people in the industry, even in the world, don't understand that. Or like you said, a dispute basically are the same thing. And how these happen is that, let's say that a consumer, you know, so the card holder gets their credit card statement, or maybe you're high tech and you get the text messages or push alerts to your phone that say a charge happened. And you look at it and you don't recognize it. So in that case, you need to actually contact your credit card issuer. You know, you might call your credit card company as a consumer, I mean, you know, like Citibank or somebody. And so you call that number on the back of the card and you say, hey, I don't know what this charge is. And that at that point, it could become a chargeback. And so the issuer generally will discuss it with you. They'll look it up and they'll see, you know, like the descriptor, which oftentimes that descriptor is not very meaningful. Depends on how you set it up, but many times that might be a company name. But like I always give the example, a lot of times that name doesn't mean anything to the cardholder.
Right.
Because, you know, maybe it's a corporate LLC or something, but the product you bought has nothing to do with that name.
Right.
So that can be confusing. But so at that point, though, if the consumer says, no, I didn't make that charge, then the issuer can press the chargeback button. And that becomes a chargeback. And what happens then, though, and this is where it gets really bad, is that, you know, it flows down the pipe to the merchant. And they immediately take the money away from the merchant. And generally, there's also a charge on top of that from the acquirer, processor, ISO, whatever parties are involved, maybe multiple charges. And then a lot of times it ends there. But what we need to do, you know, the merchant, there does have some recourse. The merchant can represent that, which is where they present additional evidence. And then if they win it, they get their money back, but it still counts against them as far as their chargeback rates go.
Right.
Yeah, and that's where, you know, as far as, you know, like what the different parties involved, you know, responsibilities, you know, it's really, unfortunately, it all falls into the merchant, in that if the merchant does not contest it, meaning represent it, and if they don't,
the loss, right?
Yeah, they eat the loss and nobody knows anything.
Right.
You know, so there are certain cases where the chargeback actually is on the issuer. But most card not present merchants don't use these services. And in the United States, there's not a lot of acceptance of the services. So things like, you know, chip and pin for in-person situations where like, we don't use the pin. Americans don't like that.
Right.
Annoyingly. And you can do 3D Secure, which is sort of like that, but that requires, again, basically a pin. And Americans aren't good about entering those. So we don't tend to use them online in the States. It's very popular in Europe. But yeah, so that's kind of how chargebacks works. You know, how I see it, generally very unfair to merchants.
Yeah. I mean, I've always felt that way myself. And it also seems kind of, the rules kind of become so arcane sometimes. I mean,
have you tried to read them?
I have.
It's not fun.
It's not fun.
And it's really confusing.
It really is.
I have a client in Honduras that he was getting chargebacks like almost a year old transactions. And I told him I'm 99% sure that's not okay. You know, it's supposed to be 180 days. You know, so I dug through the rules to make sure, because it's Honduras. I hadn't dealt with them before.
Right.
And I was right. And then I actually asked MasterCard about it, somebody over there, and they agreed with me. But they also sent me to the rules. And you know, there's so many ways that, like, in certain situations, it can actually be longer. But yeah, they're so confusing. No merchant ever reads them.
No.
Then generally, when we give a merchant account, we don't tell them anything.
Nothing about
just
that.
Here, sign this thing. We'll let you process.
Right.
It's like a mortgage.
Then all of a sudden this thing comes back and it's like, what is this? Why am I being charged for this?
Yeah, and that's why, you know, I've spent a lot of my career, ever since I first got in trouble with chargebacks, trying to help merchants figure it out. And you've got to stay up to date. You've got to stay connected to the right people, the right groups. And if you don't have the information. At least it's not up to date.
Well, you mentioned briefly about the new visa rules, and as I understand it, they made this rule change that's supposed to primarily address friendly fraud, and it's called CE 3.0.
Yep.
Now, what I'd love for you to explain to our audience is the background, who does what, when it took effect, which I think you mentioned, but just to reiterate, and also most importantly, what does CE 3.0 stand for?
Sure. Well, let's start there. So CE3 stands for compelling evidence.
Okay.
It's a third or maybe more than that version, but they're calling it 3.
Okay.
The big difference is that, so compelling evidence, if you've ever done a representment, that's the data that you provide to your acquirer as a merchant to say, this chargeback is not legitimate. I delivered this product. This consumer knew they were buying this product. It was that consumer. So you can provide that evidence. And there used to be some general guidelines, but there wasn't a cut and dry, if you do this, you will win. And that's what CE3 is all about. And it's also, in a way, it's meant to, like, if you go back a little ways, go to, like, say, 4 or 5 years ago, Visa brought out kind of their first predecessor to this, which was BMPI.
Okay.
And that was Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry.
Right.
And that's what actually the last business I had that I exited back with Count and Equifax was a company built around that. Like, I was in their kind of beta. I built the merchant interface to that for a lot of merchants. And it was a great product. But the problem was, again, so there was no cut and dry rule. And 2, it was hard because you had to have a lot of data. You had to respond really fast. And that actually still holds true today. But what a lot of merchants had the biggest problem with was that there's no way to know. Like, if you call your credit card company, are you going to do a chargeback? Or are you just calling to ask?
Right.
Ask a question. But I would get the ping either way. So I had to charge for it because I was being charged. So, but there's no way to for sure know that was going to be a chargeback.
Right.
And so what CE3 does is it solves 2 of those problems. So you still have to have a lot of data. You still have to be very fast. And my company, Fraud Flex, solves for that. The other 2 pieces, though, the fact that there's no kind of cut and dry rule, you win if, that's changed. So now, and like you said, it's about friendly fraud. So now if you get to provide an IP address or a device ID or a device fingerprint for the transaction that they send in initially, which is the one they're trying to dispute. And then you have to send some other basic information, matching information, like you've got to match on the ARN or auth code or some other fuzzy logic. But then if you have that data and, like, the consumer, the name, also like an account ID, like email or something, and then you send that to them, and then if it's a 10.4, so basically friendly fraud, then they're going to ping back again, and they're going to say, hey, give me information that matches, hopefully, on transactions that are more than 120 days old and less than a year old, and have not had a fraud dispute. So it could be like merchandise
on this account.
On this account with, so this merchant account,
right?
This credit card,
right?
Meaning this customer bought from you before and they did not dispute that transaction,
right?
Exactly. And so then, and if this is recurring, and this is a huge piece, I think, if it's recurring, you can take those same data points from the initial consumer initiated transaction.
Right.
So maybe they're charging back month 10 of a recurring transaction. Well, you don't have IP on that, of course, because the consumer didn't interact. But you can go back and grab the IP address or device ID from the transaction the merchant or the consumer did initiate when they started the subscription. You can pass that in. And so as long as these data points all match, then Visa will actually jump in and say, hey, issuer, this is not a valid chargeback. You may not do this. And then, so there's a small fee there, but there's no refund. It does not count against you as a chargeback in your chargeback rates. So that's big because, you know,
Yeah, that's really
the
big.
problem with alerts,
Right.
other products, you got to do a refund. And so if you're, you know, legitimate merchant and you're not in a big chargeback trouble, you probably just want to let it go to represent. But then you got to win that, you know, but in this case, this is basically how I look at it. This is real-time representment pre-chargeback, which means it doesn't count against you. Whereas, you know, one of the stupid rules that the car brands have are if you represent and win, it still counts.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it shouldn't, but that's how it is. We don't have a choice on that. So CE kind of fixes those problems.
So the compelling evidence is things like the same IP address being, you know, accessing the same card for the same product over a period of 6 months. That's what you're talking about there.
Yep.
And what you're also saying is that if you're able to, you know, to respond to these queries, you're not racking up disputes that can count against you.
Correct. Yeah. So there's no chargeback. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when you say count against you, for those who don't understand, maybe explain that a little bit more, of this idea of like how you can only have so many chargebacks.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the big rules in merchant processing, and I just kind of call this like a hidden rule, because I sure didn't know about it when I was starting out. I didn't know about it until a bank called me and said, well, we're going to hold a bunch of your money and shut your account down.
Right.
And had no notice. Right. And that still happens today. I have plenty of clients that happens to, or has just happened to, and then I help them get out of the problem. So what the situation is that, so one, there's kind of a hard and fast rule that your chargeback ratio, so the number of chargebacks, and this is important, the math here, the number of chargebacks that come in this month divided by the transactions that come in this month. So if you understand the merchant world very well, you understand how this is kind of problematic, but that's the rule. So if that's over 0.9, then you can be put into the Visa chargeback monitoring program, or I think they call it actually dispute monitoring program now. Additionally, if your transactions that are flagged for fraud, not necessarily a chargeback though, if that ratio gets over 0.9, you can be placed in the fraud monitoring program. And that one, annoyingly, it's the same math, except it's by dollar amount in USD, or doesn't really matter what the conversion is. But so we always figure in USD.
Big chargeback is a big problem.
Exactly. And so those two programs are super important, and merchants get in trouble all the time. And it's always been weird, is if I win a representment, why does that count against me in these programs? Yeah. But it does. With CE3, it does not count against you.
So that's one of the really
friendly fraud.
Right. So that's one of the really big differences from the legacy requirements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you can present more evidence earlier in the process.
Yeah, and there is a rule, because it used to be it was totally up to the issuer. Now it's if you meet these criteria, it's up to Visa, and it's automatic. And this, just to be clear, you can do this in representment too, but then it still counts against you. So it will be an automatic win whenever your acquirer puts the data into VROL, but it still counts against you, unfortunately. And so, you consider how much it costs.
You know, I'm sorry, I was going to say, to clarify that, what you mean is, as a merchant, if you go through one of the legacy programs with the same data that you would do with CE3, you would potentially win the chargeback, meaning you wouldn't have to, you know, refund all this money to the merchant. But that chargeback still counts against your, like, staying below 1% of transactions, whether it's number of transactions or volume, to where you can start getting your account either shut down or monitored or all these other issues, right?
Yep, exactly. And so, you know, so it's how I see it. It changes the game for a lot of merchants. And then, like I said, the other rule that's changing is for certain MCC codes, I know the fraud program is going to go down to 0.25. And so that's even more troubling.
Wow. What MCC codes would those be?
So I don't want to say exactly, because I'm not sure it's all
super high risk, I'm presuming.
You know, it's really not. Like, one of them, for example, is digital good games. And I know a lot of my video game friends are in that space, or in that MCC, and they're not high risk. Not really. Not if you understand them. But when you look at the definition of that code, it's more geared toward like games of skill, which is high risk. And there's a number of new codes that are being put into that right now. I think that happens June 1st. Like I'm going to do a video and stuff on that soon. I'm trying to make absolutely sure I'm right on the codes.
Sure.
Because it's been hard to get clear information around this. But it's scary. Like, just that they can change that so fast. But flip side, the good thing is we now have these new tools to stop it.
So Scott, what are some of the difficulties or challenges that you would see payment processors and or merchants, facing with this kind of shift to CE3, and what can be done about that? What are you guys doing about it with your company?
Yeah, well, so the problem we had back whenever VMPI came out, this is not a new problem. And really, if you think about it, with almost any merchant tool, I would say that one of the number one or one of the top problems is always if you're a fraud or payments person at your company, getting a budget, right? You need to get a budget to handle this stuff, and you need to get a budget to get your IT people, your engineers to work on it.
Right.
Because this requires real-time data access, right? And a lot of data. A year of historical data for a good-sized company, that's a lot of data. Yeah. And to search it that quickly and on multiple, you don't know what they're going to send you, right? It could be, you could get ARN, but maybe you don't. You could get off code, but maybe you don't. So it could be even a kind of a fuzzy match. So it's not simple. And so, that's one problem, is just getting that budget, getting that data and access to it. And then once you get it and you got to get engineers to work on it, and then just maintaining that system and keeping it running, those kind of things are huge issues. And with that, like I said before, I think you have to be fast. And so like VMPI was under 1 second response time, but that's from the time Visa calls you, starts the call. So that you've got to take into account the time from them to you, the time for you to search it, for you to transform it, for you to, put it into the payload and send it back. And then it's got to travel across the internet, which is fast, but considering we're talking only a second here to maybe search millions and millions of records, it's difficult. Now they have said they're raising it to 2 seconds. Yeah. But I've heard rumors that that's not really the case. Like they're cutting them off quicker than that. And either way, 2 seconds is still very fast. I know a lot of companies may have trouble with that. But it just happens, nicely for me, I guess. That's my background. Like I started out in the engineering world, optimizing big databases and building APIs. And so, so I've taken on that again and I've built that up. And so what we're doing is, we're going to provide the infrastructure for that, where a merchant can choose to either allow us to host their data, or we can call out to them via an API if they're fast enough. Right. And then we handle the transformation and security and everything, connecting and talking to Visa to exchange that data. And then also all the logic behind it. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of different, logic you could apply to this and how to optimize around it. Like, maybe you don't always want to respond. Maybe you want to represent. Sure. Maybe, maybe you want alerts or not alerts. Maybe you want, there's a lot of different places. And then also based on the data coming, what data do you want to send? Do you always want to send the same stuff? Or maybe you don't, especially if it's not necessarily going to qualify. Right. You need to see, well, could it? If it doesn't, you still want to send data back, because you could still win at that point. It's just not a rule. It's not hard and fast. It's just you're giving this information to the issuer. They see it in their CRM as they're talking to the consumer. So I always tell merchants, think about it as an extension of your customer service.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So I didn't even realize all the 1 second rule and all that. So basically that's because, if I'm understanding the context here, you're saying that, a consumer is calling their bank, basically their issuing bank or their credit card company, and saying, I don't think this transaction is legitimate. And so you're saying that in that moment, like within the context of this conversation, the issuing bank is able to put this information in to dispute this transaction, and CE3 is kind of intercepting this and saying, hey, if you can send us back this data within like a second, well, then we're going to keep this consumer on the phone for a second, and we're going to say, well, hold on a minute, consumer, you did buy from them. In fact, you had a transaction 3 months ago with them and you didn't dispute it, right? Like, is that what you're describing?
Exactly.
Pretty cool.
So that's, kind of, because, it's two pieces really. I'm calling all CE, but there's Order Insight, which has been out for a while, which is the Verify version of VMPI, which whenever Visa bought Verify, they kind of merged those products. And then now Verify OI is taking, it's step one, and then CE3 uses the same rails to pull that data. And so yeah, like, maybe your transaction does not qualify for CE3, but you still want to send as much data as you can because it's in real time. It's like, if you call somebody up and ask, hey, what is this transaction? You don't want to wait 30 seconds, right? It needs to be immediate. And so that's why you've got to have these very fast responses.
Yeah.
So let's do this. So kind of as we close this out, because this is super interesting. I feel like I've already learned quite a few things today. So, as we close this out, I definitely want you to share some information on where people can go to learn more about Fraud Deflect and what you're doing. But maybe along with that first, could you give us a little context of like, what's the timeline of when you're going to be looking for these kind of relationships? And then also, what types of relationships? Are you talking about individual agents, like throwing a big merchant over the fence to you? Or are you talking about ISOs partnering with you? Like, what are you looking for? And then where do they go to learn more?
Sure. Well, so you can go to frauddeflect.com by the time this podcast comes out. We're launching that in a few days from today as we're recording this.
Oh, great. Okay.
But as far as what I'm looking for, so that's another thing I learned from building services in the past, is that a really good way to distribute a product is to have a network of partners. And so we're building this from the ground up to work with ISOs, processors, agents, it doesn't matter, any kind of company. And we'll basically, make deals depending on volume and, the rates we pay versus what we charge to the end users. Right. But, the system is fully white labelable from day one. It also can break down. So, down to the mid level. And so you'll be able to pull up, if you resell it, it can be under your brand name. And then you could have, the companies that you sell it to under there. Then you can have reporting that rolls up to you, but then also reporting for each merchant. And then each merchant can have reporting down to the mid. So yeah, really any kind of partner is very welcome. And it can be any size merchant. It takes no time at all to enroll companies into these things. And then we also, to make things even easier with the data, is we have and we'll have even more integrations into gateways, into CRMs, even into a merchant if they want us to do that, if they have enough volume.
Right. And so that website again is frauddeflect.com, right? And they can go there and learn more about it. Scott, thank you so much for your time today. I love your expertise in all this. It's definitely not, a high area of expertise for me. So I always enjoy having you on because I always learn something. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share the insights with our audience, and encourage them to head over to frauddeflect.com and check it out. This episode of the Merchant Sales Podcast is brought to you by CC Sales Pro Training. So if you want to learn more about that, we just put up a new website at ccsalespro.com. And when you go there, you can click a button right at the top to learn more about the training. We have several different options, but I want to talk about our ISO subscriptions. This is an opportunity for you as an ISO to get your agents trained on the industry, especially as you're bringing new people into the business. But even as ongoing training, it's such an important, crucial part to have the agents go through training on a regular basis.
Yes.
And, with our system, you white label it, put your logo up there. It's very cost effective. So head over to ccsalespro.com/training and check out how you can get your agents, your team trained on this industry, how to understand statements, how to understand payment processing, how to sell dual pricing. We have a variety of courses and topics that are covered there, and you can learn more about that at ccsalespro.com/training. So Patty, today I want to talk about the race to vertical SaaS solutions. When we think about the payment processing industry, especially from a sales perspective, Patty, I think of it as a series of races. There was the race to payment acceptance, was the first race. Just like business owners. This is all the Zon juniors. This is like, we got to get everybody to take these cards. There was this race, and it was like, the winner is going to be the one that gets the most Zon juniors placed. That was the winner, right?
Right.
Then it became this race to the bottom, and you had that, it was selling for 7%, whatever, and it raced to the bottom. Then it was like, okay, now we're going to do race to other technology solutions and, very generalized technology solutions, but, a little bit better, than it was the race for EMV,
Right.
chip card and all that, right? And you got to be EMV compliant. That's the race. Then it was the race to dual pricing and cash discounting and whatever. And it was like, oh, wait a minute, we don't want them paying for processing anymore. There's this race. And what's interesting about all of those races is that none of those races really had any particularly high barrier to entry for the next race. You know what I mean? It was kind of like, well, we all raced out there and everybody placed all these Xon Juniors, but then comes along the Verifone line of terminals and and Hypercom, and you know what I mean?
Right.
Dual pricing, cash discounting. It's like, well, yeah, that's great. And the idea is, people are definitely not going to want to pay processing fees if they're already on one of these programs. But if you could offer a similar pricing with a different solution or a different value, then that's not that high of a barrier. I think this next race, the one that we're in now, we're still towards the beginning of the race, and it's the race to vertical SaaS solutions or implementations. And this is a race that is so real and it's happening so quickly. It's really interesting as I talk to payment processors and agents that I would say agents tend to have a much more realistic grasp of this race than the executives I talk to be honest.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, most of them, it's almost like, oh yeah, this is an interesting trend. And it's like, no, it's not a trend. It's like the only thing that matters. And that what it is that every business out there that does not have a payment integration with a software solution that is specifically designed for their business type, with the integrations they need, with the features that they want, et cetera, right? They will have that at some time in the next decade. And so there's this race going on right now to say, we need to get every business a specific solution for their business that works for them, that has payments integrated into it. And I'll be honest, I know I'll probably make a few, I always like to make a few people upset. Otherwise I feel like I'm not saying anything interesting, but even some of these solutions, I'll call out maybe a Clover and things like that. Even some of those solutions, it's like, well, yeah, but they have this app that, right in the Clover marketplace.
Right. That makes it a little cooler.
A little cooler. And it's like, well, yes, okay, that could be good. But here's the problem. When you have an entire technology company that is focused on one vertical, right? What they can do for that vertical is just incredible, because it's not just about the technology itself or the feature list, it's also, like I said, about the integrations. And, are they integrated with the, I was thinking about, some different companies where, like, one company I know that does a thing for C stores and things like that. And, they literally have an integration with the company that pre-funds coupon discounts that are used at these stores. So when business owners accept a coupon for a 20% discount, they get that money the next day. Right. Well, I don't care what your Clover app does. When somebody comes in and says, you're going to get that coupon money back, right? Or a direct integration with the vendor to reorder their inventory automatically at a discounted rate because of the added efficiencies, right? So my point being, as an agent, so I want to talk about agents and ISOs here, and even the higher level acquirers and processors. For the agents, I would really, really encourage you to start dabbling in this. And the way you do that is pick one vertical that you really like. Don't be afraid to go outside of your normal genre, right? Like a different, maybe a card not present vertical that you normally wouldn't go after or something like that. But go after a different vertical and go after that vertical by finding a solution that has integrated payments, right? Negotiating a deal with them to either you do the processing, they have integrated through the gateway, or they pay you the residual, but you have to make sure your agreement is really rock solid. And then go out and sell that one business type. But you have to, it's like, the reason it's such a tricky one, Patty, is that it's so much more than just merchant sales. It's content marketing, and it's expertise, and it's trade organizations, and it's these new things. But I don't find these things to be necessarily incredibly difficult or complicated. It's just something different, and you just have to learn that. But I think
well, there's a clear symmetry, don't you think? I mean, between merchant services and these other services. I mean,
of course,
yeah,
absolutely. And I think, I was just having an interesting conversation with somebody on the consulting side right before we started this recording, and his question to me was, in 10, 15 years, are there still going to be merchant services agents like there are today? And I said, well, I definitely think there'll be a lot of very successful 1099 contractors who sell payment processing. But I said, I think the most successful ones are going to be those that have picked 3 or 4 verticals, maybe even just one in some cases, depending on the vertical. And then they've gone all in on that vertical and they built it out. Because what's going to happen is, when you're a generalist, and this is like economics 101, business 101, this goes back to Adam Smith and division of labor. Like, when you are competing as a generalist and you have companies at scale who are verticals, who are more specific than you are, right? You lose. Like,
right.
I mean, unless there's some really significant cost advantage that you have as the at scale provider, but that's just not the case in our industry. The payment processing, it's not it's already so commoditized that it's not like, well, we service hundreds of different verticals, so we have a big cost advantage over the company that services one. No, you don't. So as a result, you're going to lose to that other company that's going after that one vertical. And so, in a market where there's very low barriers to entry and where there's all this money to be made, it's going to be very, very, very challenging. And there's this race. And so I just really want to talk about it today. The agent for the ISO, you know what to do. You need to go acquire an ISV, build an ISV, whatever. And then you need to bring that to your agent base as a separate offer from everything else that you do, and say, we're going to dedicate a team of 4 people to this little vertical. And we're going to go after this one vertical, and we're going to become, we have these other general solutions we offer, but separate from that, we're going to go directly after this one vertical and dominate that. And then you go get another one, that's what you do. This is a race, and it's a land grab opportunity. And I think our industry is frankly doing a very poor job at grabbing this land. It's almost like we're grabbing this middle ground. It's like the whole industry right now is in this, they think they're in this land grab of all these people with a standalone terminal. We can give them a general system that's a little bit better.
Right. Just
why? Yeah. Like, why? Because 3 years from now, they're going to be doing a more specific solution. Like, you're grabbing the wrong land. They're already ready to embrace the vertical specific solution that is exactly built for them. Why are you selling them the middle ground? So, and the reason is very simple. It's because our industry has not embraced technology. They've embraced technology partnership, but they have not embraced technology. And so the ISOs and agents have to actually embrace the technology itself. So anyway, that race is going on. If you're an acquirer, and you need to be thinking about how you're empowering ISV relationships. And it's interesting, Patty, those organizations do get it. Yeah. The big acquirers, the agents a lot of times are like, man, I feel like I'm kind of the redheaded stepchild. I'm a number. These big companies don't seem to care about the agent anymore. And you're largely correct. I mean, they're shifting their focus to ISV partnerships. Why? Because there's a race. Right. And they don't think the agents and ISOs, the small ISOs, are doing a good job of. They're not even in the race. They're like running around in the middle of the field, while people they're like playing frisbee in the middle of the field.
Right. I was just going to say, playing it's like hacky sack while everybody else is playing golf.
And it's like, hey, there's a race going on, and the race is there are X number of merchants who do not have a vertical specific software solution with payments integration today, and those merchants will have one in 10 years. Yes. That's the race. So be aware there's a race going on, and it might be time for you to get your running shoes on, stretch a little bit, maybe get up to that starting line and see if you could run a couple laps. So there you go. There's your tip for the day.
Well, James, as a follow-on to our interview with Scott, I thought I'd report on the hot seat that one chargeback mitigation firm has found itself in.
Okay.
The Federal Trade Commission, as well as the Florida Attorney General's office, are alleging that Chargebacks 911, its owners, Gary Cardone and Monica Eden Cardone, took advantage of consumers that were hit with fraudulent charges to the benefit of scammers. It also alleged the company ignored numerous red flags that it was using faulty information to help these merchants successfully dispute chargebacks. The FTC and the Florida AG also took issue with a company program called VAP, for Value Added Promotions. VAP encouraged merchants with high chargeback rates to run numerous small dollar transactions using prepaid cards so they could boost their total transaction numbers and that way lower their chargeback rates. Crafty, these Americans, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and actually, full disclosure, of course, we had Mr. Cardone on the
Yes,
podcast.
we did. Yes,
I
we
don't remember
did.
when that was. It was a long time ago.
It's been a couple of years at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a complaint filed on April 12th in U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Florida, FTC lawyers and the Florida AG noted that Chargebacks 911 counted as clients several companies that have been sued by the Federal Trade Commission for deceiving consumers. These included a company called Apex Capital, F9 Advertising, and AH Media. And apparently, Chargebacks 911 had been told about at least one action involving Apex. Companies of all three companies, customers of all three companies had complained that they were being charged for ongoing subscriptions that they didn't recall signing up for. Common problem we all know about, right? According to the complaint, Chargebacks 911 regularly sent screenshots to card issuers on behalf of its clients that clearly disclosed the nature of recurring subscription payments. But all too often, the screenshots didn't match up with what the actual product pages that the consumers ordered from. So the FTC and the state have alleged that the company, Cardone and Eaton Cardone, are violating the FTC Act and the Florida Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act. They are asking the court to impose a permanent injunction against the alleged illegal activities, as well as civil penalties and compensation for affected consumers. Florida and the FTC are requesting civil penalties of up to $25,000 for each violation.
Wow.
Gary Cardone has since stepped down as CEO of Chargebacks 911, with his wife, Monica Eaton Cardone, taking over. The company did issue a statement asserting that the accusations put forth by the FTC and the Florida AG are inaccurate and promised a vigorous defense. The company also argued that the FTC and the state AG don't understand how companies like Chargebacks 911 operate, and if successful, the government's actions could have adverse and industry-wide consequences for any software as a service provider. Which I thought was an interesting argument. Yeah,
I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, it's interesting too, because of course our audience would know that Grant Cardone, of course, is very, very famous, and of course Gary is his brother, actually his twin brother. So they would kind of know that connection point. But yeah, I mean, we had him on the podcast, talked about what he was doing, and these things were not brought up in the podcast interview, as I remember, but it'd be very interesting to see how this all plays out. It does have implications, because I think the question is, how far can one of these companies go in terms of, trying to keep chargebacks out from, off of their clients? It's like, well, how far can they really go in this? And where is it? It's one thing to say there's a legitimate transaction and we want to prove it's legitimate. There's another thing in saying there's an illegitimate transaction and we want to make people think it was legitimate.
Right. And that's where this seems to have come down.
Yeah. Interesting stuff, Patty. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that as time goes on.
I'm sure we will.